that you're giving to us. And yet there seem to be details that perhaps you would want the author to explain, but they're missing. For example, you get some information about certain characters, but you really have no backstory to any of their life. This man, Barak or Barak, depending on how you would say it, you don't really know much about where he's come from. You don't know a whole lot about his journey, where he's going to before he prepares to fight Sisera. There's much time there. What's going on? You don't have any details. And in fact, some details you get, you might say, I could have not used those. I would have been all right not to know certain aspects. Or you read the story and you go, there's something about this that perhaps makes me a little bit uncomfortable. These details, is it really necessary? Well, if you've been with us over the past few months or weeks, I should say, when we're looking at this book, the book of Judges, I think what we are learning is we are learning to expect the unexpected. We have gone from a left-handed deliverer in Ehud, and now we're looking at a woman with a hammer. Now, I'm not here to put down women. I'm more saying you recognize the unexpected nature of what's taking place. If there's going to be a battle, I don't think you're thinking of a woman at this point. And so there's something to be said about this story. What is it that the Lord is trying to communicate? And so I want to look at it in 4 points. Our first point will be the setting for salvation. If you look in the first 3 verses, what you're getting is some context. What has been going on? What is happening? Now, the opening of Judges chapter 4, nobody was surprised by how the author began. What does he say? And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. You're almost anticipating that by now. This seems to be the pattern. There's a judge. He delivers the people. And then again, the people of God follow suit with where they were. They fall back into sin. But where are the people coming from? You remember with Ehud, they had 80 years of peace. Now, one might suggest if you had 80 years of peace, that should be a substantial amount of time to firmly plant yourselves and establish yourself in truth, in the ways of the Lord, in the gospel. You had 80 years, and it was peaceful. But what do we learn? Well, after the 80 years, Ehud dies, and with him, so does peace. The people of Israel go right back to where they were. It's why you see the repetition of again and again. The man who's coming to speak at our conference, our Reformation conference, in his commentary on this book, he does so quite eloquently, and he's describing this nature of sin. And he says, don't you appreciate what we're learning here? That there's something, well, it lacks a measure of creativity. There's nothing really original in sin. There's nothing really creative in sin. He's saying it's almost as though it's the same boring pattern, that you just kind of go back to the same things you've always done. And as soon as you can see it with these people, as soon as the restraint was taken, that is the life, the judge of Ehud, as soon as he is removed, the people return right back to their sin. You see, Satan doesn't need new tricks. The old ones seem to work just fine. He can attack the same ways as he always has, and it seems to be just as sufficient. And so maybe you're seeing this pattern, not just the boring nature or the boring cycle of sin, but what are we learning about Israel? She cannot save herself. And isn't that true with you and I? We cannot save ourselves. When restraints and boundaries are pushed back or removed, we go right back to where we were. And that's exactly what Israel is doing. Each and every chapter so far, she goes right back to sin. And what do we see? God has to raise up a judge to deliver. And don't you quite appreciate this evening that God has raised a judge according to our confession of faith, that he has raised his son, who what? Judges the living and the dead. that he has raised up a judge to deal with sin and to do so for all eternity. Now, what I want you to see when we're looking at this setting is, yes, they have gone right back into sin, but you hear about this new oppressor. His name is Jabin, the king of Hazor. When you're thinking about that name, it should some measure grab your attention if you know anything about your Old Testament. Why am I saying that? Well, for starters, where is he the king of? You see, yes, he's the king of Hazor, but where's he coming out of? Well, he's coming out of Canaan. And aren't you asking yourself at that moment, well, wait a minute. I thought Canaan was the promised land. I thought that was the land that God had brought his people into. Isn't that the land he's purchased for them? He wants them to have this. How is it that there is an oppressor within the land that God has given to them? And so I think that people's attention would have been grabbed immediately, because it says what Paul might say: you never finally deal with sin on this side of glory. There's a put off and put on nature. And so when you're looking up the word or the person Jabin, you're actually going to read there's another Jabin of Hazor. He's found in Joshua chapter 11. It's not the same person. It's kind of like a pharaoh. It's a dynasty. It's a popular name that is passed on from generation to generation. And what you're learning about Hazor is Canaan is not really just an empire of one kingdom. It's got multiple little city-states. And Hazor seems to be the Washington, D.C. of Canaan. That's where apparently their power, their government is being run out of. And that's why you read of Jabin in Joshua 11, but that's also why you read of him here, because it's this subtle message that says sin never dies off. It's never gone. Just because it's defeated once doesn't mean you can take a vacation. It's still, in fact, there. And until the return of Christ, the people of God must be prepared to fight sin and to fight the fight of faith. It's living in a tension. Maybe you've heard of it. The tension of the already but not yet. We know there is a day in which sin will no longer have dominion over us, but that's not today. That's not until Christ returns. And so we need to heed the Apostle Paul's warning when he gives it to Corinth. What does he say to them? If you think you are standing firm, if you think that you've got this, what does Paul say? Be careful that you do not fall. For no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And so there's this nature of sin that never seems to leave. It seems to try to have a dominion over you. And that's what you're getting in these first three verses, is this new oppressor in Jabin. This setting that Israel has gone back to where they were. They are living in sin again and again. And so you've got the setting for salvation. But then when we keep on in our story this night, what we find out is there's a prophecy to salvation. When you're looking at verses 4 through 10, you get a prophecy to salvation. It's the pattern so far of Judges is as soon as you see where Israel has messed up, where they've gone wrong, you find out who the oppressor is. Who is it that is overseeing and overbearing and being cruel in their leadership to Israel? And then you learn, well, who is God raising up? Who is this judge? And tonight, what do we learn? Well, we learn of Deborah. She's a prophetess and a judge. Now, we need to stop there for a moment and think about this office of prophet. It is a twofold office, if you remember well the teaching of the Old Testament. Prophets did two things. They foretold the word of God. That is, they said exactly what God told them to say. And they also foretell the future. That is to say, this is what God said will happen. And in our text, we get both. Deborah is both saying, this is what God has said. Listen. And this is what God said he will do. Pay attention. And so I want us to make sure our eyes are open to that. That Israel would come to her because she had great wisdom. They wanted decisions, and they came and asked her opinions and her verdicts. Now, I am well aware of an immediate controversy that has probably risen in your mind. It's a woman and it's a prophetess. And so we will deal with that issue, and we'll do so later. But let me first help settle your minds. if you're trying to look for a biblical command and a biblical imperative and a biblical model of what you and I should do, how we should draw conclusions, Judges might not be the book you'd want to start with. And so before we talk about what is actually being done here with this office of prophetess and Deborah, I would say to you, caution yourself before you just look for the immediate application for the modern church, because you remember well the refrain of this book. The people did what was right in their own eyes. Now, what are we looking at with Deborah? Well, she's a godly woman. She speaks on behalf of God to the people of God, and she's actually telling us something quite significant. Did you hear what she says in verses 6 through 9? She summons Barak or Barak, depending on how you say it, and she says, "Come here. I've got something for you. Has not the Lord said he's going to do this? Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000. And then what does she tell him? And then God's going to do something. He's going to draw out Sisera, the general. And then Barak starts. If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. What we get here with Deborah's prophecy is a command of the Lord. I've commanded you, go do something. I'm going to go do something. People of God, you need to do something. Now, this is about the time when people start picking on Barak. They start saying and making these observations, I don't know, he sounds a little bit like a coward. That he was commanded to go and he says, I don't know about that. I'm not going to go if you're not going to go. I would be careful to say, I don't think that's what the author is saying. Notice in verse 6, what's the command? Go gather your men. He's a commander of at least 10,000. He's got some form of military ability and some form of courage because he's already led and he's got at least 10,000 boys behind him ready to go to battle. And so I would say, no, I don't think you can pick on him for his cowardice. But then some people might say it's an issue of faith. You see, he didn't believe. That's why he said, please, Deborah, if you'll go, I'll go. Again, I would caution you to that opinion. Because if you fast forward hundreds of years, what's the New Testament's interpretation of this story? Deborah is not who has been raised up and is looked at. Do you remember in Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith? What does he say in verse 32? Time would fail me to tell you of Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, and Samson. It can't be an issue of faith because the scriptures themselves are commending his faith. Is he manipulative? Is he abdicating responsibility? I really just don't want to do that. No, I think there's biblical precedence. Exodus chapter 33. Do you remember what Moses says to the Lord? If you'll go with me, I will go. But do not send me out if you will not go. What's the author trying to say here? I think what you're looking at is someone who well understands who he is and his inadequacies. I've got nothing. I am utterly and fully dependent upon the Lord. Don't have me go and you not come with me. I would love, Deborah, your representation, the one who's got the wisdom and counsel from God on high. Come with me because we need the Lord. I think it's an issue of clear understanding of who he really is. Now, what's about to happen? And Deborah is saying the Lord's told you to do something and the Lord is going to, in fact, do it. There's an unexpected deliverance. If you're reading, and what does she say after he says, if you will go with me? I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now, we'll get there. What woman? But you and I are already thinking, oh, Deborah's getting it. That's what's being said here. Here's the expected outcome. It's so unexpected. You can imagine this prophecy. It's like a divine, I told you so. Imagine if Sisera got word of this prophecy. Hey, bud, I know you think you're strong, but you're actually going to get beat by a girl. You can imagine how he's going to laugh at something like that. Me, a warrior? A woman beating me? Not so much. And so what are we getting? We're getting this unexpected deliverance that's going to come from the Lord. And why is it so important? Because Deborah tells Barak, it's not about you. And I think that that's where we have to come to the conclusion. Salvation isn't on your terms or mine. We would have never written this story that way. And so Deborah tells him, it's not about your glory. It is about the Lord's. He will, in fact, sell Sisera into your hand, and he will get the glory. It's always all about him. And so we've got this setting for salvation. We've got this prophecy to salvation, and then we get the victory of salvation. What does God actually do? Is there salvation to be had? You can see it in verses 12 through 22. Sisera hears that Barak and his 10,000 troops, they're headed out, they're coming in, and so he moves his chariots, his 900 chariots of iron. Now, if you remember what Pastor Smith said about Shamgar, what did we learn? Shamgar is not a Hebrew name. It's not an Israelite name. Well, the same is true of Sisera. Sisera is not a Canaanite name. And I think it's quite intentional because you're not going to read a whole lot about him. What are you to learn about him? He's a hired mercenary. His only pleasure is in killing people and taking care of them physically. You'll learn about some of his bad habits and some of his evil deeds, even in Judges chapter 5. And so this guy has nothing of good in him. He's just a hired hand to kill. And so how would the people of Israel have heard this? Well, they've been under this oppression for 20 years. And so they're going to find out that there's 10,000 people, and they're going to go, so what? What are the 10,000 people going to do against the 900 chariots of iron? This is your Navy SEALs against your youth group. This is not even a comparison. This is a tactical advantage beyond measure. Nobody would have ever wanted to challenge Sisera in that kind of military ability. And then you know the story. They go out to battle. And verse 15 tells us the Lord routed them. And he sold Sisera into the hand of his people. Except for what? Well, Sisera decides to get off his chariot and make a run for it. And so he leaves his men where he should be fighting. He makes a run for it, and all of his men are defeated. And that's what the text says. Every one of them. None of them are left. And Sisera heads north. He goes to Heber's house, the Kenite, and that's where we meet Jael, and he thinks that they're on safe terms because apparently they were. She says, come on in. He says, I'm thirsty. So she gives him some milk. Apparently he's tired, and so he goes to sleep. And she takes a peg and a hammer, and you can put the math together what comes next. And you can recognize what the text is trying to say, how unexpected and yet how specific. It actually tells you she drove the peg through his temple while he was asleep. And if you were still questioning what happened, so he died. It's almost a repetition of what is really taking place. It's an extremely uncomfortable story, isn't it? What do we do with a text like that? Why would the Holy Spirit inspire a passage like this, especially with a result like that? I think there's at least two reasons. Let's look at verse 14. What does verse 14 tell us? And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? It's an issue of faith. Why is this inspired by God? What are we to learn and how are we to be instructed? This is what Deborah is telling him. Get up and go. Prepare yourself. Fight. The Lord is actually going to do it. He said he would do it, and now is the time for him to do it. God said he would go, and God said he would win it. Do you believe it? I believe it, Barak, but do you believe it? That's a question that you and I have to wrestle with. Do you believe that the Lord will fight for you? Is he a warrior for his people? Maybe you remember Psalm 23. We always think about how encouraging it is, and it should be encouraging. But there's that scene towards the end that perhaps is unsettling. What does Psalm 23 tell us? He's going to prepare a table for you and me, and you get excited. I want to sit at that table. And then you find out where the table is. It's in the presence of your enemies. Do you believe that God will fight for you? Do you believe that God will take care of your enemies and his? It's an issue of faith. That's why I think it's here. Barak, do you believe that God's going to do this? If you do, then go fight. And then secondly, I think it's an issue, or a reason for us to adhere to it, is we get a picture of the justice and judgment of God. I didn't make this point just for time's sake last time when we talked about Ehud, but do you see some similarities here? What do we find out? Both Ehud and, yes, we'll talk about her, Jael, they confront an oppressor to the people of God, but they do so one-on-one. They're taking the highest evil man in the land and they're taking him on one-on-one in a private place and in a place where they might see themselves as comfortable. And what happens? It's the same result. They both die. And what do I think the Lord is trying to say is sin will never be hidden forever. It will find its way out. And you and I can never escape the judgment of God. It's an impossibility. You can go to the bathroom, Eglon, or you can go to the hill country where there is no war and you're on safe territory, and yet the judgment of God will still find you. It's both meant to provide a measure of fear for us, but also a comfort. No evil thing will go unpunished. God is holy, and he will deal wholly with all people. Now, I want to be clear on what's happening here. The Bible talks about areas of what we should do and what has happened. And you could say it this way: the Bible is both descriptive and prescriptive. You kind of have to determine and discern which one is which. When we're talking about descriptive, it's exactly what it sounds like. Well, here's a fact. This is what happened. This is information. I want you to know it. Prescriptive is something slightly different. You should do this. You should emulate this. This should be a model to you. Now that's where this story gets uncomfortable. What do we do with this? You'd want to say it's just descriptive until you get to Judges 5 and you find out the scriptures actually commend Jael and what she did. And so how do we handle this story? Well, two things. I don't think you should build your conviction for how you deal with enemies in our day based on this story. Do not wear a belt of pegs and have a hammer walking around and taking care of every enemy that you have so come across. I think what Jael is representing is the judgment of God. And you and I, as the people of God, ought to pause and say, do I really have a deep understanding of his justice? More than that, do I have a real understanding of how much God hates sin? And perhaps if you wanted to peel that back one more time, do we have a real appreciation for how God hates those who oppress his people and that he will deal with them? And so we've got an uncomfortable story, I understand, but mostly it's because I think we've had a marred, a distorted image of who God is. We talked about it in Psalm 23 just a moment ago. How do you view God? You see, if you go into the Christian bookstores of today, you get this little shepherd that is cute and cuddly, and he's holding some fluffy little sheep, and this just looks like the greatest thing ever. But is that the picture of what David was talking about in Psalm 23? Do you have these sissified shepherds who hold a stick in their hand and just pet at a petting zoo all day? That's not the shepherd. How would you have understood the biblical shepherd? They were warriors. They had a club in their hand. They were fighting against fierce enemies, both animals and perhaps even physical people. They did whatever it took to secure the safety of their sheep. Is that your understanding of God? Do you believe that he is a warrior who truly fights for his people? Or is he just some kind of lame, cuddly softy? Or is he holding a club in his hand? You see, when you put your faith in Jesus, you're not putting your faith in one who was defeated. You're putting your faith in the one who defeats. He defeats his enemies. He defeats sin. He continues the fight against sin, the flesh, and the body, the world, the devil. How do you view him? It makes a big difference, you see, because the Lord has been at work to deliver his people. And so you have a setting for salvation. You have a prophecy to salvation. You have the victory of salvation, and then you get the planner in salvation. I actually skipped a verse if you've been following along. Not that that's your details you're supposed to give so much attention to. But did you find it odd when we were reading the text where verse 11 shows itself? Verse 11 seems to interrupt a perfectly good story with a detail that you're wondering, is that really important? Now Heber the Kenites had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tents as far as away